Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Hannah, and today we're going to be looking at Language Paper 1, Question 2 um, for the exam board AQA. So if you are doing a different exam board, much of what I'm saying will be applicable to the questions where you're asked to analyse language. So you can stick around and have a look at how the skills might be presented in exam answers. But just bear in mind that some of the advice is very much only really applicable to AQA, for example, the number of paragraphs you're writing and things like that. So welcome. Lots of you might already be familiar with Sherpa. Some of you might even be familiar with me. I have been with Sherpa for a few years, and obviously I'm biased, but I think they're wonderful. If you're interested in getting a tutor, either for yourself, for another subject, maybe going on to A-Level, maybe you've got siblings who could do with a bit of tutoring, just have a look underneath this video and you've got a link to my profile and also to Sherpa, who can help you out and direct you to someone who might be able to help. Today we're going to go through this question. We're going to talk about the expectations of the question. We're going to talk about the things you should avoid. We're then going to have a look at annotations, so making notes on extracts, making sure that they're effective. And we're going to have a look at how you should be writing your paragraphs to make sure you're getting the maximum marks for detail. At the end, we'll have a little bit of a question and answer. So if at any point you have any questions whatsoever, you can pop it in the chat down at the bottom somewhere. So yes, please do feel free to ask a question at some point and I'll get to them at the end. So let's get started. You can see I'm also using the Sherpa classroom. So this is what is used, if you're not familiar already, when you have lessons with Sherpa. So you'll be seeing how the classroom functions and some of the useful tools that they have. So I would suggest pen and paper in hand as we go through. This would be a good idea for a title. So yes, let's get started. So just a reminder, first of all, of the aims of the question. So as you can see in that top box, it's all about you showing your understanding of how writers use language to achieve effects and influence readers. So the word how, whenever you see how in an English exam question, it means you have to look at methods. So you have to be looking at what the writer is doing on purpose to achieve something in the reader. In this case, it's only what they're doing in terms of language. Remember, the structure question for AQA is question 3. So you save all of that stuff for question 3. Effects and influence we will come to shortly on the next slide. And I'll kind of explain what that actually means. Subject terminology should be used accurately and only when relevant. So what that means is if you spot that the quotation you have chosen to analyse in this particular question is a simile, call it a simile. What we don't want is students just naming techniques that they can find, that they spot. So for example, if you are analysing a simile and you happen to notice its alliteration as well, if you are not analysing the effect of the alliteration, if you're not saying the alliteration creates a harsh sound or mimics the sound of breathlessness or something like that, don't mention it. You don't need to mention alliteration, only the technique you are actually analysing. That's a really important way of getting those top marks in this question. I think the way that it says that on the mark scheme is it says sophisticated use of terminology, and that's basically what it means. Only using the techniques, mentioning the techniques that you're actually analysing. And finally, so it's 8 marks. It's approximately 10 minutes of your life in this exam. So don't spend too much longer on it. So yeah, it's 10 minutes, quite a short question, but it's a really helpful one for boosting marks. This language analysis is all the stuff you've been doing probably since year 7. So the first time you walked into an English classroom and your teacher said, today we're going to be doing PEE paragraphs, PEA, Peter, Peel, Pretzel, whatever your school calls them, that's this question. So I just mentioned the effect on the reader. The big misconception with this is that students assume that means what does the reader feel? Now, yes, it does mean that. However, it's not necessarily what you feel. And that sounds silly and annoying, but it's what you think the writer wants you to feel. So if you think they are trying to make you feel uneasy or nervous or excited, that is the effect that you're looking for. So it's just kind of understanding what you think the writer has tried to do. What you can also see is it's not just how they feel, it's also what the reader understands, learns, or just what they think after reading a particular part of a text. So that's important to remember because it's not always just about an emotion, what they feel. It's all of these things as well. So hopefully that opens up what you can talk about a little bit more. Um, but again, as I said, we'll look at some paragraphs later on. We can talk about what that looks like in practice. So these are just some bits of advice to bear in mind. So I think this is going to be available on YouTube after it's all finished. So if you need to come back, pause, and have a look at some of the advice here again, you absolutely can. I'll just quickly go through what these different things mean because they're all things we're going to come back to as we keep looking at these examples moving forward. So as it says here, we need to be zooming in on specific words. So that means when you've chosen your quotation that you're going to be using as your evidence for a particular paragraph, this question, identify the one, maybe the two words that most powerfully or convincingly create the effect that you're talking about. So usually sometimes it will stand out quite a lot which word it's going to be that's zoomable, that you can really analyze the connotations of, the impact on the reader. Sometimes it might be the more subtle words. For example, has the writer gone from using I to we? What might that suggest in that sentence, for example? So yes, looking very carefully at those individual words. And I've said in the second box there, if you can, do it twice for your chosen quotation. AQA like you to say a lot about a little. So choose a relatively short quotation that has loads of stuff you can analyse in it. So preferably two words, one or two words in that quotation that you can really narrow focus on and say exactly what the effect is. This third box, if you really feel like showing off, try two different interpretations. Remember with English, it's not about mind reading. You don't have to guess exactly what the effect is. Just if there's, there might not be one effect, there might be several. So show your flexibility, show off how you can use your brain to think about things from with different approaches. So maybe a quotation could be understood in two, even just slightly different ways. And you can just briefly explain the two different interpretations. And that might get you some extra marks for being what we call perceptive. Basically means really thoughtful. You've really taken your time to think carefully about the language that is used. This middle blue box, be precise and specific. We don't want massive, huge, long answers. We don't want you to fall into the trap of thinking that the longer the answer, the better the answer. That is not the case, believe me. You can write for a whole page and sometimes there is nothing or not very much that you can give credit to. But you can read a relatively short paragraph where every single sentence adds to your interpretation, adds to your analysis. And that is what we mean by being precise and specific. Really only talking about what you need to in a condensed paragraph. You're aiming for 3 paragraphs. If you write 2, but they're lovely and detailed, that can still get you pretty far. It says each with a different point. We'll look at that a little bit later as well. This idea that we don't want each paragraph to start in the same way, because then it's the same point. So the writer uses language to describe the garden when they write, and then we have a quotation. That's a bit too vague, a bit too open. We want you to actually make a specific point. The garden is described as frightening, for example. Nice and clear, specific, to the point. Then you give me your evidence, then you analyse. So your points should be quite short, but they should very clearly outline what you were going to talk about in that paragraph. Remember, your paragraph is all about proving your point. If you haven't got a specific point, you're not going to have a lot to prove. So bear that in mind with your points. This next one, make sure all of your points are linked to the question. I know it sounds obvious, answer the question, but exams are horrible. Our brain does all sorts of horrible, strange things sometimes. So just to help ourselves out, it's a good idea just to check your work as you go through. Check your point. Does it actually, am I talking about the garden or the dinosaur or the mountain at this point? Am I talking about the thing that the question has asked me to? If not, we need to change your point. The quotation choice is really important. So obviously your quotation is it's your evidence. It needs to prove your point and it needs to be analysable. If you're not analysing, you're not going to get marks because this question, the only thing it's asking you to do is to analyse, and that is to look closely, to pick apart the language, and as we said at the beginning, to talk about why the writer has chosen these particular words. So quotation choice is incredibly important because without a good one, you can't really analyse and then you get a bit stuck. So quotation choice is important, and we'll talk about how to pick a good one a little bit later. So here we go. So I keep saying language, analyse, analyse, and we need to talk about what counts. So it's words and phrases. So that is just any particular word that stands out as being interesting, powerful, anything that stands out as linking in linking to the question, of course. So words and phrases absolutely count. The best one, probably, that's going to get you the furthest, are the language features. Those are things like similes, metaphors, personification, imagery, all that stuff. Those are language features. Generally, those kinds of techniques will lead to the best analysis, particularly if they're more kind of what we might call abstract. So maybe they're a little bit weird, maybe they compare to something strange. And it just gives you more space to kind of think about, okay, why is the writer comparing the mountain to a toddler? Why would they do that? So it kind of helps you show off your analysis a bit more because you have to think a bit more deeply about the choices. So yeah, simile, metaphor, personification, imagery, all of those things count as language features. Sentence structures, I would think these are a little bit more risky because there's not always as much to say about sentence structures. If you're not confident talking about sentence structures, I would recommend focusing on the first two. Sentence structures are things like, has the writer used a short sentence, a simple sentence, a complex, kind of long, rambling, complex sentence, and why have they done that? The reason it's a little bit more risky is because you might get a little bit stuck with actually talking about it in depth. For example, what lots of students do is they might spot a nice, short, dramatic, short, simple sentence that stands on its own, and they might say it's done for dramatic impact. But what impact? You need to explain it a little bit more. Why is it important that the impact is created? How was the impact being created by that short sentence? So yes, the sentence structures are a little bit harder to talk about, I would say. So if you're not feeling confident with them, words and phrases and language features will get you the furthest. And of course, you don't have to write about all three of these, as I've already kind of hinted. If you want to leave out sentence structures, please do. So yeah, you don't need to talk about them all. Right then. So I mentioned earlier PEE, PEA, peel, Peter, paragraphs, all that kind of stuff. I like pretzels, and you might think, I'm not going to remember, pretzel looks long, I'm not going to remember all of that. And you don't need to remember the exact order necessarily. It's about the specific things that are mentioned within the pretzel that are worth remembering. So, for example, making a clear point is incredibly important. I've also said it's a good idea to mention the writer at that point as well. By mentioning the writer frequently, so you can see the bits in pink, they show the examiner that you know that this piece of work that you're analysing is not real. It's been constructed, and it's been constructed to create a particular purpose in for a particular purpose to achieve a certain feeling or reaction in the reader. So by mentioning the writer's name, it's a reminder to the examiner that you know you're examining this text as a construction, a piece of work that's been put together with care and thought. So yeah, as I said, you can come back and pause to have a look at that in a bit more depth and detail. Um, we've already talked about quotations being short, zoomable. This bit down here, so all of these bits here are the, in fact I should start here actually with the effect. Those are the bits that help you analyse. So the effect, after you've introduced your quotation, you can talk about the overall effect of the line, of the quotation that you've chosen. So you might talk about the tone or what you can infer from it. So it's almost like an introduction within your paragraph to your analysis a little bit. So yeah, the overall kind of effect of your quotation. After you've done that, you can then identify the technique wherever possible. So you might point out that it is an adjective that you're going to be focusing on. You might point out that it's a simile, something like that. And remember, only mention the technique that you're actually analysing. So we don't want an overload of techniques that you're not actually analysing just by mentioning them. Zooming in, I've said a couple of times, so that's where you really narrow your focus on a particular word, maybe two. And what you might do here is actually combine a bit more terminology. So for example, if you're analysing the effect of a simile, and then you zoom in on a particular word, and that word is an adjective, call it an adjective, and you're showing the examiner the extent of your knowledge of the terminology as well. So as it says here, just a reminder of what we talked about before, talk about maybe connotations, why is it an important word within that quotation. What you might do actually is you might be doing the zooming in twice, because like I said, if you can analyse two words in your quotation, that's lovely, as long as it's nice and concise. So you might do the pretzel, the inside bit of the pretzel, so it might be a pretzel almost, rather than a pretzel. And towards the end of your paragraph, we need the effect, so we need to bring in this idea about the word that we've zoomed in on. So we need to bring in our connotations, our understanding of that word, and talk about how it contributes to the quotation as a whole, before we then link back to our point. So remember, each paragraph is a beautiful gift for the examiner. Lucky them, they get to read your work. The link is like you're tying a bow to make it all come together. So the link brings everything back round, ties up the beautiful present that is your paragraph, basically. So yes, just a reminder about the pretzels. As I said, it's a general guide and you can use it flexibly. One thing that students get worried about is, will it sound too formulaic? Will it sound too robotic if I follow the same pattern? And to be honest, if you're doing what you need to do in the exam, it doesn't really matter if you're going to sound a little bit kind of, following the same order of analysis. To be perfectly honest, it doesn't, as much as you think. As long as you've got the information that you need and you're explaining it clearly and specifically, it's okay. So yeah, be flexible with it. As it says here, you don't have to strictly follow the order each time. You just need to remember to include each of the key elements in the analysis. So for example, the zooming in, the terminology, all that kind of stuff. So here we go. These are some of the things that will make the examiners scream, cry, growl, all of those kinds of things, because they often indicate that the student knows what they need to do, but they're just not being quite specific enough. So this has an effect on the reader. What effect? If you don't name it, you can't get the mark. So this has an effect on the reader is too vague. What we need there instead is something like this makes the reader feel nervous or tense because. So it's a specific feeling that you're talking about. This word is powerful. Why? I had that and left it. That's not enough. You need to say exactly why it's powerful. This influences the reader's feelings. That's very similar to the first one. You need to say what feeling is it influencing or what is it creating in the reader. This makes the reader confused. I mean, there are a few writers who might want to make you feel confused, but you probably won't come across those until university. But most of the writers who have written things that are being used in GCSE exams, most writers probably in the world don't want to confuse you. They might want to challenge you, they might want to make you ask questions, but they're not going to want you to be confused because remember, they want you to read their work. And if you're confused, you're not going to. And in fact, one thing that's not on this screen that maybe I should have included actually is this makes the reader want to read on. Not many writers want you to stop reading after a few lines. So we don't need to say that it makes the reader want to read on. We need to say why we are intrigued or why we're asking certain questions of what's going on in the text. So just bear that in mind. That if you feel confused, then there might be a misunderstanding somewhere. And you might need to change which quotation you're looking at. The writer uses language. Well, they're not using interpretive dance. They aren't using, paintings to show us. It's an English exam. It has to be language. So we don't need to say the writer uses language. We just need to say what technique they're using. We need to show our understanding of English, how we analyse English language. So instead of the writer uses language, the writer uses a simile to do something. So that's much better than saying the writer uses language. As it says here at the bottom, all of those sentences, all those sentence starters are a bit too vague, and they could be applied to basically any quotation. That's not showing your understanding. And so you need to be more specific. What you say about a quotation should apply only to that quotation. I shouldn't be able to pick up your analysis and apply it to another quotation. In fact, it could even, as it says here, it might get you stuck at kind of half marks if you're too vague because you're not showing true understanding of language. It would be called an attempt at analysing, and that's half marks. So that's worth bearing in mind. Nice and specific in your phrasing. So there we go. So the actual skills themselves, how do we show our skills? I've got an example here from a paper some of you might have seen. It's often referred to as the Mill paper, which is about a family driving in a van and it's raining horribly and the father tells his daughter to get out and collect some flowers that have fallen onto the road. So this is the extract you were asked to look at in the for question 2. And what I've got on the left hand side is a bit of a reminder, like a to-do list, basically, of how to approach the extract. So number 1, how would I describe the overall tone of the extract? And I should ask that first because it's going to help me find the quotations which are going to help me answer. So, Hartop was driving, a thin, angular man, starved-faced. He seemed to occupy almost all the seat, sprawling awkwardly, so that his wife and their daughter Alice sat squeezed up, the girl with her arms flat as though ironed by her side, her thin legs pressed tight together into the size of one. The Hartops' faces seemed moulded in clay, and in the light from the van lamps were a flat suede colour. Like the man, the two women were thin, with a screwed up thinness that made them look both hard and frightened. So already I can get the impression. Got words like thin, angular, starved, awkwardly, squeezed, ironed, pressed, moulded, flat, screwed up. All of those words suggest to me that this is um, a quite a claustrophobic kind of feeling. It's a feeling of discomfort and awkwardness. Um, they're a family, but they don't seem very happy. So the overall tone, I might say awkward, unpleasant, I might say claustrophobic, kind of that feeling of being enclosed. So all of those things there are going to help me to think about how I might describe the Hartop family, or how the writer describes the Hartop family, I should say. So, um, yes, what we're looking for now is what specific feeling the writer is trying to evoke at this particular point. Um, I need to ask, does that feeling change at all? So, as we read, as I said, all of those examples I gave were very kind of similar. They were all very negative. So I don't think it does change. What specific feeling was the writer trying to evoke, to create? Um, that question there, I might say, I think the writer wants me to feel maybe a bit wary of Hartop, the father in particular. I think they want me to feel sympathy for Alice and his wife. Um, so that's what I think the writer wants me to feel. What does the writer want me to think or learn at this point? Well, I'm learning all about how the family connect or don't. I'm learning all about how the family um, are, I suppose, not a proper unit. So all of these things here, all of those words I've just been using, could be used to formulate my points. So disconnected, unhappy, uncomfortable. All of these kinds of things help me develop my points. Um, and they should also lead me to my evidence. So I've got to start thinking about what kind of quotations prove all of those ideas. So um, let's have a look. In this short extract here, as I said, we've got words like thin, angular, star-faced, awkwardly. So I might start to highlight these words that stood out to me. Girl was squeezed up, arms flat as though ironed, thin legs pressed. Hartop's faces seemed moulded in clay, flat suede colour, screwed up thinness, made them look hard and frightened. Now, all of those things I've highlighted link to those ideas that I just mentioned. However, I'm not going to be talking about all of them. So I've got to now think about which quotations I can actually analyse in the most depth. One of the ones that students picked for this exam question was this one here. Seemed moulded in clay. Now they picked it quite rightly because it's clearly an interesting technique, it's an interesting description. The problem was students picked it and then didn't really know what to do with it. So they knew it was a good quotation, but they couldn't put into words why it was intriguing. And that means that they shouldn't have picked it, basically. If you pick a quotation and you decide, actually, I don't really know what I'm saying, I don't really know what I'm trying to say, abandon it and pick a different one. So, as it says at the bottom here, when you have considered your questions, so what am I feeling? What do I feel at this particular point? What am I supposed to learn or feel here? I need to ask myself, can I actually analyse them in depth? Can I zoom in on them twice? So what I've got is an example. There we go. Um, and it's the difference between a 7 to 8 marker and a 5 to 6 marker. So I'm just going to pause there just while you read through, and then I'm just going to quickly talk about the differences between those two examples there. Um, and while you're doing that, I'm just going to quickly plug my laptop in because the it might run out of battery, so I won't be a moment. Just start reading through those, and as I said, we'll go through that in a moment. Okay, so hopefully what you've seen from reading through those, as I said before, if you don't have time to properly read through all of it, you can come back and you can pause whenever you need to. Hopefully what you can see is that the difference between these two doesn't seem maybe massive, but again, the language in this one, the 7 to 8 marks, is just a bit more specific. Um, so it's one of those questions where you're not directly marked on your choice of vocabulary, but indirectly you are a little bit because we want it to be as specific as possible, and that means choosing your words carefully. So what we can also see is how, just find some examples. Um, so this bit here, yeah, so in the 5 to 6 marks, the phrase almost all implies that he left very little of the seat for his wife and daughter, so he was being thoughtless and selfish. The adverb awkwardly suggests how difficult it was for him to fit in the van, maybe because he was so tall and lanky. If we compare that to what's said over this side, the use of the adverb awkwardly, so they've identified the same thing here, um, where it says that he seemed to occupy almost all the seats, falling awkwardly, not only reinforces the impression of Hartop's body being tall, sharp, and skinny, but also that in deliberately sprawling, spreading his frame, and taking up the space in the van, he was self centered and intentionally selfish towards the others, a difficult person in mind and attitude to life, as well as in body. So it's these little things here, things like deliberately, um, intentionally selfish, things like that. Those kinds of word choices elevate your work. So, also things like reinforces. So, what you've said before is being backed up by an extra bit of information. So, what you've got here are all the elements of a pretzel. We've got a clear point, we've got things like terminology, we've got a quotation that is clearly well chosen because of how much detail the student has been able to get from it. So zooming in on awkwardly, for example, and sprawling. So it might not seem like a massive difference. I mean, I'd still be very happy with 6 marks out of 8. But if we want those 7 to 8 marks, we need to make sure that we are choosing our words as carefully as we possibly can. So if we have a look at another example, this was a paper that lots of students really hated because it's quite subtle and quite tricky, but I like it. So let's just quickly go through again, asking ourselves those questions. So I'm going to read through it and I'm going to ask myself, what is the overall tone of this extract? So This is Rosabelle. She is a like a working class girl who works in a hat shop in kind of the early 20th century, I think, so the early 1900s. And she's on her way home on the bus. Um, so Rosabelle looked out of the windows. The street was blurred and misty, but light striking on the panes turned their dullness to opal and silver. And the jewellers' shops seen through this were fairy palaces. Her feet were horribly wet, and she knew the bottom of her skirt and petticoat would be coated with black, greasy mud. There was a sickening smell of warm humanity. It seemed to be oozing out of everybody on the bus. And everybody had the same expression, sitting so still, staring in front of them. Rosabelle stirred suddenly and unfastened the top two buttons of her coat. She felt almost stifled. Through her half-closed eyes, the whole row of people on the opposite seat seemed to resolve into one meaningless, staring face. So again, I've got these hints that the overall feeling of this is just, well, ugh, kind of a bit, it's a bit dirty, smelly. The idea of warm humanity, that's, sweat. It's a bit too warm and stuffy on the bus. Um, I'm sure lots of us have probably experienced a similar thing on buses and trains when they're full. Um, so, yes, the overall feeling is one of discomfort again, one that is emphasising that this is not a nice time on the bus. However, we do have these contrasts as well. So, for example, we have mentions of opal and silver and jewellers' shops and light striking the panes, so things shining outside. So, actually, we've got some contrasts in there. So, what specific feeling was the writer trying to evoke at this point? So, if I look at this point here, I might say, I think the writer was trying to suggest something about Rosabelle herself, that she was noticing things maybe that other people weren't. Um, but it's quite a beautiful image. Maybe she was kind of daydreaming out the window, looking at the shiny things, the beautiful things. She works very hard in a hat shop, as we learn in the rest of the extract. So maybe she's trying to distract herself, imagining the things that she can't afford, the beautiful jewellery as she goes past, things like that. What did the writer want me to think or learn? The thing that stood out to me is this bit down here, where everyone is described as being kind of the same, just kind of, they're just one big glob of human. They don't really have any of the features that I described. They're not moving. But what is interesting is that Rosabelle does. So Rosabelle stands out again as different to the others. So that's the thing that I would focus on. This last bit down here, so for this last bit of advice that I've got written down, I need to ask, can I actually analyse those quotations that I'm going to choose? So I might look at the idea of the metaphor were fairy palaces, the jeweller shops. I might look at the idea of sickening smell of warm humanity. Seemed to be oozing out of everybody on the bus. Rosabelle stirred suddenly and unfastened the top two buttons of her coat. In fact, I don't even need all of that. I just need stirred suddenly. Whole row of people on the opposite seat, ... seemed to become one meaningless staring face. So I've got lots of things I might choose. The one that stood out to me the most is actually would be this one. However, that's a good example of one that is very hard to talk about as well. So if I were to ask myself, could I actually zoom in and analyse that in depth? A little bit, but I probably could do other ones better. So for example, the idea of a smell oozing out of everybody. Oozing is this kind of sensory imagery. Smells don't ooze. Ooze is what liquids do, thick liquids. So it emphasises just how disgusting and stinky and horrible it is on the bus. That the word oozing, this sensory imagery, this almost onomatopoeic kind of word, is used to emphasise just how awful Rosabelle's journey is. The example I've got on the next page is a complete response. It's a little bit longer than it might have to be, um, but we'll go through and I'll kind of tick where this person would get some credit. Um, as I'm sure we know, it's not 1 mark equals, so 1 tick equals 1 mark, because English doesn't work like that. It's about where you can pick up credit for showing off your skills um, in various places. So I'll show you where this person would pick up credit for what they've done. What you might notice as we read through is that the language is quite complex. It's very well chosen. What I will show you in a moment on the next screen is an example of how you might simplify the language and still do pretty well. So the writer uses metaphorical language, terminology, to describe the bus journey as completely unremarkable, as a completely unremarkable and dull experience. That's a good example of a specific, clear point um, that doesn't say the obvious, for example. So they haven't said uses language, they've said metaphorical language. So it's the method. They've linked it to the question by mentioning the bus journey. And they've actually used some kind of key adjectives to describe exactly what they want to prove about that bus journey. This is evident in the final sentence, where the writer states that the passenger's expressions appeared to come together in one meaningless, staring face. That is a well-chosen piece of evidence. The concept of each individual blurring into one collective suggests that Rosabelle has become so used to the bus journey that she no longer acknowledges specific details of the passengers. If you remember back to the pretzel, after your evidence, I suggested talking about an overall effect, an overall effect of the quotation you've chosen, and that sentence there is a good example of that. The journey is such a mundane, so boring, event that it has numbed Rosabelle's mind to the point where she no longer recognises individuals. So this is where this student starts to expand on their idea a little bit more. They start to explain how it links to Rosabelle and what it's showing about her in a bit more depth. It could be implied that she is losing her own individuality in this respect. So she's losing her sense of who she is. She's just another person in a big group of other people. She doesn't, she's not herself. She's not special or anything like that. By no longer appreciating fine detail, she is becoming, like the other passengers, a bland vessel. A vessel is like an empty thing that is used to just get from one, to move something from one place to another. So if we were describing a person as a vessel, we're implying that they kind of are empty. So like an empty jug, they're just a thing to be moved from one place to another. That simply goes through life without paying attention to it. So again, everything coming together, everything kind of being built on and explained really clearly and specifically. What we've got here, if you remember, I mentioned earlier about alternative interpretations. We've got an example of that here. So, however, this idea is contrasting to Rosabelle being the only person to move on the bus. So we've said how she seems to be kind of just another one of the people, just kind of boring, bored, going home on the bus. But she is the only one to move. That is a clear point. It's also the method that is being used by the writer, because we've pointed out that she's the only person who's mentioned as moving. Rosabelle stirred suddenly, well-chosen evidence, while sat on the bus. The verb stirred, they have zoomed in on a key word, they've identified the technique or the word class. The verb stirred implies Rosabelle is different to everybody else who are sitting so still. So whenever we talk about contrast, we need an example of what makes it a contrast. And we've got the stirred suddenly and the sitting so still. We've got the movement and the stillness. So that is proving the contrast that we've identified. Also, the verb suddenly conveys a spontaneous aspect to Rosabelle's character. So again, we've zoomed in on suddenly. Spontaneous means unplanned, sudden, and it's linking to Rosabelle's character. So again, you're showing your understanding of the language being used and the character that's been created, which is in opposition to the seemingly dull, monotonous. Monotonous again means boring. rhythm that the other passengers live by. So again, clear understanding of the quotation that is chosen. Overall, the bus journey is a draining experience that seems to suck the individuality out of each person. However, Rosabelle still manages to retain some of her unique traits and has not fallen into the same slow monotony that's taken everybody else. You don't need a little conclusion at the end of your answer to question 2, but you're welcome to if you are kind of bringing together 2 different interpretations. It might be a good idea just to bring the 2 together, just to clarify that you know that you haven't contradicted yourself. You've just built on with different interpretations. So that last little bit, I would just say, is maybe an option when it comes to things like conclusions. So what I've got here is an example. So the language, as I said, on the left is what we just read, quite tricky language. The one on the right hand side is slightly simplified, but is saying exactly the same thing. So for example, instead of saying completely unremarkable and dull, you might say completely regular and dull. Instead of saying, let's have a look. Yeah, also the adverb suddenly conveys a spontaneous aspect to Roswell's character, which is in opposition to the seemingly dull, monotonous rhythm. So if we compare this bit here, very kind of complex, well-chosen language, to the more simple, also the adverb suddenly shows a more exciting aspect to Roswell's character, which is opposite to the dull, uninteresting rhythm of the other characters. You might have even just said opposite to the dull, uninteresting other passengers. So you are saying the same thing, but in simpler language, and you can still do just as well as if you're using simpler language, as long as you are choosing your words very carefully. So that's just worth bearing in mind. I know sometimes when we look at models that have complex language can sometimes be a bit off-putting, thinking my vocabulary isn't like that. It doesn't need to be. Just be careful, be specific, and you'll be fine. So on the final slide, oh no, sorry, not on the final slide. I forgot I've got this as well. This is what AQA said about that example there. They point out exactly where the language is going to get top marks, basically. Detailed and perceptive is what's at the top of the mark scheme. So the top of the mark scheme says you need to have a perceptive and detailed understanding of language. Detailed means, you're zooming in, you're showing you understand the full quotation, very detailed, full of depth. Your analysis is full of depth. And perceptive, as I mentioned earlier, means thoughtful. So have you picked out the best quotations that you can analyse the best, basically? Can you zoom in once or twice in depth? And they highlight the 2 examples of where the student did that is where they've said things like this. Oops. So all of that bit there, those are the 2 examples that are given that show thoughtfulness. It's very hard to know what counts as thoughtful. Basically, what counts as thoughtful is that you have looked so carefully at a text, you've picked up on things that maybe lots of students might have missed. So that's the key thing, basically. If you're reading carefully enough, you will spot things that won't be as obvious. So yes, that's what AQA said about that response before. Right then. This is for you to have a go. So if you want to kind of put into practice some of that thought process that we've talked about, you can come back to this video, pause it, work your way through those questions and see, is it going to help you figure out your overall points and your evidence as best you can for this question. What I would encourage you to remember for this question, I keep using the same words, so detail, specific, and precise. So those are the key words to remember. Also bear in mind, if you have an extract and you think, actually the language is really hard to understand, there are lots of words I don't know, that is, look for what you do know. You will know more than what you don't know. and that's really important to remember. These extracts might have words that you're not familiar with, but again, it shouldn't put you off from having a go at the bits that you do understand. Um, Remember, the examiners want to give you marks. They don't want to punish you. They don't want to take. They never. They're not supposed to take marks away. They don't take marks away. It's all about whenever you show a skill, they want to give you the marks when you show that skill. So you've just got to give them plenty to work with, basically. You've got to be the one to give as much detail as you can for them to be able to see how wonderfully flexible and analytical you can be. So if you want to come back to the video, you can watch this, pause it, have a go, and see if you can answer that question at the top there. So that's pretty much it for question 2. It's a short question, but it's one that you can really show off your skills for, and it's one that is hopefully a bit of a confidence boost. It's a reminder that you can really analyse language. You've been practicing for a long time, I'm sure, and yeah, all exams are about showing off, really. So that's important to remember. Show off what you can do. The next thing we're going to do is, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. I'll be able to see what you're writing. Just open it up. So if you do have any questions, just type them up now and I can answer them. If not, I mean, I'm sure you're welcome. You've all got my the link to my profile. So if you do have a question that you think about after, I'm more than happy for you to send me a message, and I'll give you an answer as best I can. As I said, if any of you are interested, or if any of your siblings or friends will need a tutor in the future, please feel free to send me a message or to give Sherpa a call or send them a message, and they can help you out as well. Oh, I should also mention as well, if you're going on to A-Level, if you are interested in A-Level English, you are more than welcome to get in touch with me and Sherpa, and they'll be able to help you out. So yes, I can't see any questions so far. Hopefully that's a good thing. Let's have a look. Yes, so I think unless there are any questions that pop up now, I don't think there are any, which is fine. Like I said, please feel free to send me a message if you do think of any. Thank you very much. I wish you all the very best for your exams. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine. You're here, so you've got the right attitude. You're revising, fantastic. Not everyone does that, so you're already ahead. So yes, all the very best, and thank you very much for joining. Thank you. Bye.